Cuba is seeing its largest protests in years, and the question, of course, is why now? And I think above all, economic factors are key to explain the situation. Cuba is facing its worst economic crisis in decades, since the early 1990s, in fact, when Cuba had to adapt to the end of Soviet aid. Cuba has also benefited from Venezuelan economic help over the past years. That's no longer the case. The US embargo complicates the economic situation in Cuba further. But most importantly, I think the pandemic explains the situation. Tourism and remittances are two key areas that have been hit especially hard by the pandemic and explain why we have food shortages, high prices, and in general, a very difficult economic situation in Cuba at this stage. Contrary to China and Vietnam, which succeeded in liberalizing their economies without opening up politically, Cuba has resisted economic reform, which also explains relatively low growth rates over the past years. And finally, while we can only hypothesize, there is some reason to believe that the more widespread access to the internet has facilitated communication between the population and has allowed activists to coordinate these protests more easily than only a few years ago when there was very, very limited access to the internet. While reports from what's going on in Cuba have gained quite some visibility in the public debate across the region, governments have been reluctant to comment on what's going on. And I think there are two main reasons for that. The first is that the region will face a lot of political volatility over the next months because of the pandemic and all the economic hardship it has caused. Leaders are above all concerned about maintaining domestic stability. So there's less of an appetite to comment on regional issues, and we see that in the breakdown of regional cooperation, of the lack of visionary leaders at this stage who reimagine the future of the region, very little of that. So as a consequence, I think we won't see any cohesive response to what's going on in Cuba from Latin America. And the other issue that's also important is that differently from the United States, there's no domestic constituency that will pressure Latin American governments to take a stance vis-a-vis Cuba, because the Cuban diaspora is largely concentrated in the United States and not in other Latin American countries. I think there's several issues we can watch. The first is whether these protests reoccur, and above all, whether they spread to other cities, which would make repression more difficult. The second is to what extent the government will be willing to sit down with protesters and accept them as legitimate interlocutors. So far, the government has made one concession. It has announced that Cuban Americans coming from the United States would be able to bring in food and medicine without having to pay tax. Now, that's above all a symbolic gesture, and protesters are likely to have other more political demands, and we'll have to watch these kinds of conversations that may be going on. The most likely scenario is, however, greater repression and government attempts to set an example to disencourage future protest. And finally, we will have to watch the domestic political scenario in the United States. Clearly, the Biden administration may have an incentive to show voters in Florida that the US government is willing to take a tougher stance vis-a-vis Cuba. So that's above all a domestic consideration, which to some extent will shape the way the United States will react to what is going on in Cuba in the coming weeks.